Thanks for coming to the last Lincoln Leads for this year. And we're in for a really special treat tonight. We've got an outstanding panel with a really broad range of perspectives and expertise, and I'm really looking forward to hearing their insights on this topic tonight. So firstly, we're going to be hearing from Professor Nigel Emptage, who I believe is the head of the only science department in this university that was recently rated #1 in the world in its discipline, the Department of Pharmacology.
Thank you. That's so true.
Professor Emptage is a professor of synaptic pharmacology at this university, which he joined in 2000 when he came from the National Institute for Medical Research in London, where he worked with one of the founding fathers of mammalian plasticity field, Professor Timothy Bliss. During this time, he worked on developing new optical methods for imaging synaptic activity. He completed his PhD in the Department of Zoology at the University of Cambridge, which was then followed by a Cirque NATO fellowship at Yale University. And it was during this time that his interest in the cellular mechanisms of synaptic plasticity became firmly cemented. And as the only card-carrying neuroscientist on the panel tonight, I'm looking forward to hearing his thoughts on the topic. Following that, we're lucky to have Dr. Arabella Simpkin, who's a paediatrician, who holds faculty positions at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston and Harvard Medical School. She's a graduate in medicine from this university and holds a master's in medical education from Harvard Medical School, and she's a member of the Royal College of Pediatrics and Child Health. Her focus and passion is particularly focuses on resilience, tolerance and uncertainty, and understanding the mechanisms at play. She has formal training in cognitive and behavioural psychology, instructional design and faculty development. And she is going to be talking about how the human brain processes uncertainty and how we can improve high performance and well-being. And finally, we've got Michael Chen, who many of you will know here at Lincoln. He's a Rhodes Scholar from Stanford and a star of the future. He conducted neuroscience research whilst at Stanford, investigating neural circuits that control thirst motivation. And he's the first author of a paper in Science, as well as a number of other high-impact publications. During his time at Stanford, he co-founded Synapse, which is a non-profit organisation that provides social support to people with traumatic brain injuries around the US. And he's reading an MSc in Global Health Science and Epidemiology at Oxford. And so could you please help me in welcoming Professor Nigel Emptage.
I know I'm under the cosh of the clock 15 minutes ago, so let's see what I can do in that time. I decided, since I am the card-carrying neuroscientist of the group, that I should tell you some neuroscience. And I thought I might start by telling you something about popular untruths, things that people will often say that are not quite correct, and that I will tell you those because I think that to understand what is not quite right is a good starting point for framing the solution to a problem like this one. Because of course, if you believe some of the things that you might read in the popular press, you might think that resolving a problem such as this is rather straightforward. But the truth of the matter is, and I don't think it will really surprise this audience, is that it's not straightforward at all. It's extremely hard. And I hopefully will convey quite why it is so challenging in the next few minutes. So let's see if I can do something very cerebral and make this work. Yes, brilliant. So, one of the things that I think we've all seen at some point in our lives in newspaper articles and things of this sort is that we don't use all of our brain. And of course, if that were really the case, then developing strategies by which we could utilise the bits we're not using routinely would be something that we could really focus on as scientists. Regrettably, however, that is completely untrue. We do use it all. No bits are just there for the sake of filling space, like polystyrene packing within the skull. And let me tell you a brief story to underscore this point in some considerable measure. This gentleman here has been known in the clinical literature for many years as HM. His name is actually Henry. for a tribute to our rector, I thought talking about Henry would be a good start this evening. Now, Henry rather regrettably suffered from catastrophic epilepsy as a young man and had elected to undergo surgery in order to attempt to resolve the epilepsy. The epileptiform foci, so the area of origin of the epilepsy, was in a brain region known as the hippocampus, so named because it looks in cross-section a lot like a seahorse. So, bilateral removal of the hippocampi, which in human beings are terribly tiny brain structures, produced a remarkable outcome for Henry. Completely cured his epilepsy. So at this point, one might be delighted. However, there was a fly in this ointment, and the fly was a very large one. Henry never forged a new declarative memory from that day forward. His capacity to form memories of facts, faces, people, etc. had completely gone, even though the resection of brain tissue was very modest indeed, a very small in volume structure within the human brain. Many illustrations of things of this type, lesion studies, resections, brain injuries, traumatic stroke, have revealed that every single part of the brain is there for a very specific purpose. Occasionally, we might miss what that purpose is in some individuals, and there are clearly examples of people with brain lesions that leave full and fruitful lives in the absence of certain areas. But then when you probe carefully as to what it is that is consequential for those individuals, you can always find something. So, for example, a particular cerebellar lesion might compromise your ability to be a wonderful ballet dancer. But if you're judiciously avoiding being a ballet dancer, that might not manifest itself as being terribly consequential. So, myth one dispelled, I hope. So, what else might I dispel? Well, one of the things I've often seen is that people with particular deficits, so for example in this case, absence of sight, blind people, have heightened senses, that somehow there's a compensatory process, that on losing one's vision, all of a sudden your sense of touch, or your sense of smell, or your sense of audition, are fully augmented. And this would suggest that there's a plasticity within the brain that was lending itself to growing these extra super skills, and that would give you potential for further brain development going forward, one might think. Well, sadly, that is also not the case. But of course, people with these deficits attend to tasks very, very carefully indeed. If you are wholly dependent on your sense of smell or touch because of your absence of sight, your attention to the task in the senses that you have available to you is really, really intense and augmented indeed, but it doesn't mean that they're specially enhanced. And tests such as this one, comparisons of haptic materials, I think this is a lovely intellectual space. Haptic materials, car manufacturers are really very much into this at the moment. The idea that you can interact with the world without actually really physically interacting with it, the sense of touch as being rather relevant here. But exploring in sighted individuals, but blindfolded with training, and in blind individuals, the performance in dealing and recognising materials, what is being concluded over and over again is that there's fundamentally no actual difference. So easy wins are not so straightforward to find. One of the things that we human beings like to believe, of course, is that we have the most sophisticated brains of all. That is something that you often see peddled in the popular press. I would argue that that too, albeit with some small caveats, is also false. And the sort of basis under which I would frame this are examples such as these. These are rather lovely images. What are we looking at here? Well, we're looking at the top, the auditory spectra of a number of organisms. The fact that elephants can detect infrasound in the way that we cannot, or that bats and dolphins can detect sounds in the ultrasound frequency and across an enormous dynamic range, far greater than ours, is a testament to the fact that for those species, they've got parts of their brains that are dedicated to optimizing the performance for those particular sensory inputs. The pit viper, remarkably, can see in the infrared. We can't. We can do it with cameras, of course. But that organism can detect things in the infrared spectrum, a warm object in a room, in the way that we simply cannot. Again, dedicated brain space is afforded to that organism to solve that particular task. So that's sort of vexing because, of course, aren't we special? We like to regard ourselves as such. But if that's really true, what makes us so, if it's not at least some of the performance criteria as mapped in terms of brain space occupied for certain tasks? Well, the truth of the matter is that we're special in the sense that, like all pack hunters, we communicate. We communicate a great deal. In fact, in terms of sort of linguistic performance, we're really out there on our own. We have developed language. We have evolved language. But of course, other organisms can do this as well. So here we see hunting dolphins, and I find that a sort of remarkable image where you see that the dolphins, by form of their communication, their clicks and high-frequency tones, have managed to corral a population of fish on which to predate upon hyenas, chimpanzees. All of these organisms communicate well too, but simply not as well as us. As hunter-gatherers, we learn to communicate to very great effect, and from this evolved language. Now, the joy of language is that it allows us to pass information transgenerationally, so that we can perform disproportionately well as compared to our predecessors. We can share information in contexts like a gathering such as this one, where I can tell you something and you can go away, reflect on it, change your thinking around a particular intellectual space, perform an experiment to show that I'm wrong in my thinking, or add to value to what I've already said. But the fact that human beings have done this for millennia makes an enormous difference to our overall performance and ultimately our domination of the planet. Now, I tell you all of this because, of course, you're thinking, well, how does this relate to the question? I mean, you know, this Emptage chap, he's really gone off on a tangent there. But what I want to try and think about is whether we can subvert evolution a little bit. The reason that we perform in the way we do is because we've evolved into that space. The reason we appear to have performed disproportionately well is our capacity to share information that derives directly from our hunter-gatherer lineage. But can we subvert that? Can we add value to that? Well, this is a vexatious problem, not least of all because we have about 85 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons to play with. And if they all did unique things, and they were all very different, that would be a challenging problem indeed to start changing things in the performance of individual entities. Fortunately, it isn't quite like that. The thing that's remarkable about these neurons, though, is not only that they're beautiful, but that the problem that we have to face doesn't even stop there in the total number of neurons that we have within the CNS. Take a look at this lovely structure. This is a pyramidal cell in the human cortex. In blue are the axon branches of that cell. These are the output elements of that particular cell. In red are the dendrites, the input elements of that cell. And in orange off to the side with the 10 micrometer bar there, those little thorns that you see on that structure are the synapses of that cell, or some examples of the sort of physical manifestation of the connection points that this cell forms with other cells around it. Now, the truly alarming thing about this is that for every human cortical neuron, there are about 10,000 of those input sites. If you were a Purkinje neuron in the cerebellum, you would have about 100,000 per cell. So I've already told you there's a large number of cells, but embedded within that, there are an extraordinary capacity for connection between those cells. And those people that like to spend time calculating permutations and combinations come up with this rather terrifying number. There's 150 trillion potential connections that you can establish between these. That's a lot of capacity to subvert evolution, but going about that in a meaningful way isn't going to come easily. Now, does this mean that the problem is insurmountable? Well, there is a bit of good news in my talk, and the good news takes the form of this, that for all of the complexity and large numbers of neurons, the organisation of the individual neurons are very, very ordered. That large areas of the brain are structured in ways that are just repeating units of entities that just go on and on and on. So just in the way that a computer chip will have consistent arrays of transistors ordered in a very particular pattern, mammalian brain has groups of neurons ordered in highly consistent ways. And what I'm showing you here is a section of the brain region that I alluded to when I referred to our patient that had the hippocampal section, a slice of hippocampus. And what you see here is that there are three principal cell types, populations within that structure, and within that these cells order like uniformed soldiers on the battlefield, that they're highly ordered and there's a lot of repetition in the process. It suggests that there's huge amounts of sort of parallel processing taking place within these structures that gives us some interesting options in terms of how we might think about resolving the problem framed at the beginning of the talk. Now, one might say, well, perhaps looking at disease states might give some insights into the sorts of things that we might think about using to subvert evolution. And it is certainly the case that these synapses, these specializations that I've alluded to, play a very, very important part in the cognitive performance of we human beings. And there can be no greater illustration of this than looking in post-mortem at the brain tissue of patients that have succumbed to diseases such as Alzheimer's. And here we see the dendritic spines, the specialist structures, the synapses within a healthy human brain, and now the consequence of Alzheimer's disease on the dendrites and on the synapse number in that same type of tissue. What I hope is very obvious is that you've lost large numbers of synapses. The synapses disappear, and so does the cognitive performance. Ultimately, the cells too disappear, and the other things manifest in those diseases that the neuropathologists will identify. So one solution, you might think, to subvert evolution would be to generate mechanisms by which we could produce more synapses. That might be the answer. If we've got more synapses, then surely, since synapse number equates to cognitive performance, more of them ought to equate to enhanced cognitive performance. And in a sort of way it does, but not in a way that's wholly helpful. Here, take a look at this. Here we have tissue, again, post-mortem from humans, of healthy brain pyramidal cells and the specialist dendritic spines within them. And here we have tissue taken from a patient that sadly passed away for other reasons, but was autistic. What I hope is very obvious in that slide is that the number of synapses in the autistic patient is hugely augmented, much, much greater. But I don't think we wish upon ourselves autism. That whilst it's clear that for those conditions, cognitive performance might change and in some ways even might be enhanced in certain savants, it is not a wholly desirable outcome. And so a straightforward fix in terms of subverting processes that just increase synapse number is not the solution. So, what about drilling down and looking at what's going on at these synapses? We all know that between two cells, neurotransmitters, chemicals are released. They're released from one cell to the other, and that is how information transfers between those. And we know the identities of all the transmitters within the human brain. That is very clear now. So maybe the answer lies in generating situations where we don't have more synapses, but maybe we have more or less transmitter. Sadly, the consequences, however, are as diabolical as in the AD in autistic patients. Too little transmitters of certain types generate conditions such as depression. Too much transmitter generate conditions such as epilepsy. So simple pharmacological manipulations that could elevate the transmitter levels in the central nervous system or depress the transmitter levels within the central nervous system each manifest with outcomes that are not at all desirable. So what is going on? Well, I'm aware that I'm very close to the end of my 15 minutes, but let me tell you where the real thorn in the side of solving this problem lies. It's in this rather annoying cyclical process that we see here. It's called homeostasis. It's the fact that biological systems are remarkably good at correcting themselves when there has been some distortion in some part of a biological pathway. So if we look as human beings to intervene and subvert something, a compensatory process will engage within the CNS that will offset some of the effects that we've brought into place. And that if we totally break this circle in some way, in other words, we damage the homeostatic process, then you move into conditions such as Alzheimer's or epilepsy or Parkinson's or autism. So the trick here in solving this problem is a very, very challenging one. The trick is getting the balance right. Working out how you subvert evolution in a very controlled and manipulated way, but subtly adjusting the balance of the system such that you can bring about subtle outcomes. Regulating disease, that is not at all straightforward in many cases, but is a far easier problem to solve than actually achieving full enhancement above the finely tuned, evolved cognitive performance where we find ourselves today. So, at that point, I'll pass the baton on to my colleagues and see what they make of that slightly pessimistic, but I believe wholly realistic interpretation of the problem. Thank you very much.
It truly is a treat to be here. It always feels like I'm back home when I'm within the walls of Lincoln College, and it's a joy to have escaped Boston's winter that never seems to end. I'm humbled and honoured to join you today to think about this fascinating question: how far can we push the limits of the human brain? And it's no easy feat to follow Nigel. I'm going to take us in a slightly different direction, and I will disclose up front that I suspect I may leave you with more questions than answers, which I will take as a win. I want to start with a quote from a fellow British physician, John Keats, now over 200 years old. At once it struck me what quality went to form a man of achievement, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And I think this quote serves as a poignant reminder of a goal that we have long strived for as humans, to get out of a space of uncertainty. We have strived to create certainty. Because the reality is, uncertainty makes most of us feel very vulnerable, and we consequently look to escape it. Unfortunately, this has been, and will continue to be, a futile quest. To date, we have been in pursuit of unambiguous certainty. As we think about expanding our limits, I want us to consider whether we can push the human brain to truly embrace uncertainty. I want to first take you back to August 2006, when it became clear to me how powerful our desire to appear certain is. On August the 2nd, 2006, I walked into the John Radcliffe Hospital, just down the road, as a newly minted surgical house officer for my first shift as a proper doctor. The daylight in this photo is a little misleading because I actually started on night shifts. And as I walked up to the hospital, I'd always assumed when I had this prefix doctor before my name, I would have the confidence and certainty that had seemed to be exuding from all the doctors I had ever followed as a student. And yet somehow, as I walked up there on that first shift, I felt like a total imposter. I arrived, I took these 2 pages, put them to my waist like 2 little grenades that could go off at any point, and I met the surgical registrar. We went through the list of patients, and he then told me with some certainty that he was off to bed, and short of a life-threatening emergency, he really didn't expect to see me until the morning. So I started wandering around the ward, and at about 2 a.m. the pager went off. My heart rate skyrocketed, and I answered the phone, and a nurse on the other end of the phone asked me if I would come and prescribe something for a patient who had painful hemorrhoids. I put down the phone and panicked, because although I could have told you the pathophysiology of hemorrhoids and the long-term surgical management, what to prescribe for a patient with painful hemorrhoids at 2 a.m. had not been in any of the exams that I had taken, and it wasn't in the Oxford Handbook of Clinical Medicine that I had strapped to my side. Now, I have no doubt that the nurse knew exactly what she wanted me to prescribe, but to admit I don't know, to admit that I was uncertain, seemed to me to be admitting that I didn't deserve to be in this role and that I didn't deserve this job. I didn't know what to do. I felt I had to have this air of certainty. And so at 2:30 a.m., because I'd spent half an hour panicking, I went into the broom cupboard and I phoned my father. Luckily for me, my father is a physician, and what I since realised is that in that moment, I was tapping into something called well-held vulnerability, where you can be vulnerable, you can admit uncertainties, you can admit your insecurities, and yet still feel respected and included. Now, I have to be honest, this strategy worked really well for me, and I used to phone my father quite regularly before I would admit I didn't know to any of my seniors, and I really felt sorry for my house officer colleagues who didn't have this helpline. But I also recognised that I was just playing into our culture, that we expect certainty. We have a culture that so often equates uncertainty with ignorance or failure. And as I looked back through the education system, I realised that the reality is we have an education system that is set up to prioritise and reward certainty. From an early age, our school system creates a hierarchy of subjects where we value maths and science over subjects like art and drama. We value subjects that connote a sense of certainty over subjects that really epitomise and celebrate uncertainty. And even within a maths syllabi, often through elementary school, we prioritise calculus and algebra over statistics and probability. We have an education system that gives examination results. We give multiple choice questions. We inculcate a notion that there is a right and a wrong answer. We inculcate a notion that we should be striving for certainty, that certainty equates to success. Our drive for certainty makes sense from an evolutionary standpoint. Our natural discomfort with uncertainty is a legacy of our survival instincts. We are more comfortable with what is familiar and certain. It hasn't killed us yet. The unknown, the uncertain, could be dangerous. Certainty is rewarding, and so we have evolved to steer towards it. We're now far from the life-threatening scenarios in most of the spaces of uncertainty that we sit in, and yet we still have the same response that our ancestors had to seek to avoid it and to eliminate it. The challenge is that as we move further forwards through the 21st century, anything that's certain, anything that's black and white, anything that you can program an algorithm for will be taken over by machines. And our value as humans is going to lie in the grayscale space, in that space of uncertainty. We evolve on a millennial timescale, and yet we're in an environment around us that is rapidly accelerating. And there is an increasing mismatch between how we function and how we cope with uncertainty and the demands that are going to be placed on us. Our anxiety management system is not set up for 21st century living. The amygdala, two almond-shaped groups of nuclei that are located deep within the limbic system, considered to be one of the most primordial parts of our brain and the primary structure responsible for our fight or flight response, starts firing and lighting up when we're in a space of uncertainty. It's been shown that we find uncertainty to be more stressful than predictable negative consequences. The amygdala is good company for the wrong journey, because the reality is we so often are in spaces of uncertainty, and having our limbic system start firing our sympathetic nervous system really doesn't help us. We are programmed to want to reduce irreducible uncertainty. And the danger is that given we live in a world where we have to make decisions amidst uncertainty all the time, is that this really can negatively impact our well-being, leading to burnout. Burnout has been described as the index of dislocation between what people are and what they have to do, and several studies have shown a terrifying acceleration over the past few decades in the rates of burnout in all professions and across disciplines. We did a study in North America where we looked at pediatric residents and using validated scales looked at their stress from uncertainty and looked at their depression and burnout. And what we saw very convincingly was that the more stressed you are by uncertainty, the further to the right on these figures, the significantly more likely you are to be depressed or to be burnt out. Now, our residents in the medical environment are having to make decisions all the time amidst uncertainty. And so to be stressed by it, to be more likely to become depressed or burnt out, has serious consequences not just for the physician, but also for the patients that they're treating and for the broader healthcare system. We also looked at stress from uncertainty against resilience and saw a near linear line that the less stressed you are by uncertainty, the significantly more resilient you are. There is no doubt that focusing on embracing uncertainty could go a long way to help our well-being. The challenge is that rather than embracing uncertainty, our approach to date has been to attempt to outsmart uncertainty. Since Hippocrates in the 5th century BCE, we have optimistically assumed that with increases in our knowledge will come a consequent increase in certainty. Nowhere was this fallacy more true than in medicine, where the quest to eliminate uncertainty from our clinical decision-making has been central to biomedical research over the last 50 years, driving the emergence of evidence-based medicine, precision medicine, and more recently, biomedical artificial intelligence. Now, there's no doubt that several of these advances really do help us on a population level, but to the individual patient, it's still often binary whether they do or don't get the complication or get the side effect. And yet, these terms connote a level of certainty that I think can be very misleading. This Time magazine cover from the 1980s epitomizes the hope felt for the Human Genome Project. It was predicted that by the year 2015, you would be walking into a doctor's office, giving a drop of blood, and being told with certainty your genomic code and the translation to the diseases you would encounter in your lifetime. We've now realized that it's significantly more complicated than that, and that right from being in the womb, epigenetic changes start to happen, and that actually in many ways more uncertainty has been unleashed than certainty. And some people have said that the Human Genome Project was in some ways the biggest disappointment in scientific history. We now think that big data will help us create more certainty. Big data will outsmart uncertainty, with Time magazines like Can Google Solve Death? 2045, the year man becomes immortal. Unfortunately, however, big data creates an abundance of information, increasing the noise and making it harder for us to pick out the correct signal. Our brains are wired to detect patterns, and our desire for certainty can cause us to close down too soon in our decision-making, picking the data to fit the story we want to tell. A good analogy for this are these two pictures, which I'm sure many of you have seen before. On the left is an image that could be a duck or a hare. The beak of the duck are the ears of the hare. And on the right is a woman. There's an old woman and a young woman within that picture. The nose of the old woman is the jaw of the young woman. The mouth of the old woman is the choker of the young woman. The hairpiece is the same for both. Now you can flick backwards and forwards between these two images, but you cannot hold them both at once. The very first time you see these images, the first image you see has to do with your own set of cultural expectations, your own biases and assumptions. And the danger is that if we close down too soon, if we want to sit comfortably in that space of certainty, if we don't sit comfortably with uncertainty, we risk missing a picture that lies beneath. Diagnostic error is now said to be the third leading cause of death in the United States, and the number one cause of diagnostic error is misdiagnosis caused by premature closure, caused by us striving certainty and closing down our decision too soon. The Mullerlyer Illusion shows how powerful our perceptions can be as we seek to make sense of the world. Look at these lines. Do they look the same length? To most of us who have grown up in environments with a large amount of rectangularity characterized by straight lines, right angles, and square corners, the bottom line looks longer than the top line. When we measure them, we see they're the same line. When we go back and look at this, even though we know those two lines are the same, the bottom line still looks longer. Our perception is very powerful. We get a rush of reward from creating more certainty in the world. It's the reason many of us enjoy doing crosswords, Sudoku, jigsaw puzzles. Because we crave certainty and want to achieve cognitive closure, we are highly motivated to seek concrete explanations and risk focusing on signals that tell a story about the world as we would like it. We risk putting things into our blind spot. Embracing uncertainty is a necessary requirement for any forward-thinking society. It will be fundamental to our well-being as we live in a world awash with uncertainty, and it is fundamental to good decision-making. But we have to find a sweet spot where we're able to embrace uncertainty and not close down too soon on our decision-making. We want to try and narrow our blind spot, while still being able to make a decision amidst uncertainty, because we are unlikely to get rid of it anytime soon. Originality requires venturing into the unknown, dwelling in uncertainty, and learning from our mistakes. It's going to be increasingly necessary in a world where machines take over the black and white tasks, and where technology can give us a false sense of certainty as we create a generation who are used to having an app for everything. Sitting comfortably with uncertainty must be our focus for the next medical revolution. For this, we will need to push the limits of the human brain to truly embrace uncertainty. This is no small feat, for as we've seen, it is counter to our evolutionary instincts, and it goes against our cultural expectations, where for too long, confidence has been valued over uncertainty. I want to end with a quote from Voltaire: "Doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is an absurd one." Understanding and embracing uncertainty could be the most significant contribution of 21st century science to the human intellect. Thank you.
Wow, it's going to be hard to follow those two up. Nigel and Arabella, those were wonderful talks. And actually, since Nigel is the card-carrying neuroscientist, I realize now that some of my numbers might be wrong, so just as a disclaimer. I'd like to start out with this image. Some of you might recognize this. So this was one of the first 3D movies that was produced. It came out in 2009, called Avatar. And in this movie, there are native people on an alien planet called the Navi, and the Navi are able to communicate through these neural connections that are found in their hair. And they can connect with other Navi, and they can connect with things in their natural environment, like trees. And they're able to share intense emotional connections with others through these neural connections. So I'll return to this, but let this kind of simmer in the back of your mind for a little bit. And I'd like to frame the talk in terms of not only how far can we push the limits of the human brain, but how far should we push the limits of the human brain? And I think it's important to consider both of these questions, and especially since the theme of this seminar is medical ethics. So, with that, let's first start out with how far can we push the limits of the human brain? So we already got a great background about the human brain from Nigel, and the human brain, as he said, is composed of, about 85, maybe 86 billion neurons, depending on how exchange rates fluctuate. So we have 86 billion neurons, and each has about 1,000 connections on average. Some say there might be 10,000, but the numbers can vary. And the human brain it's highly efficient. It only requires about 10 watts to operate. Whereas if you compare that to a computer, computers can require anywhere from 100 to 200 watts, and even higher for supercomputers. And what makes the human brain amazing is that it can carry out massively parallel computations due to the sheer scale of the structure. It's not impressive from a single neuron perspective. Neurons take a long time to signal to other neurons, relative to computers. But the sheer scale makes the human brain extremely powerful. So in this digital age, where computers are everywhere, how can the human brain keep up? Right? We have computers in our laptops, in our phones. Computers make up the back end of a lot of common internet technologies, internet services like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and they're even in things like cars that we don't really think of as being computers. And in addition, going further, artificial intelligence is on the rise. Just recently we had AI systems developed by DeepMind beat some top human Go players. They've beaten top chess players as well, and more recently they've also started defeating humans in a video game called StarCraft. So, what fundamentally separates humans from computers in terms of our abilities to keep up with AI? I think one of the big limitations is bandwidth. So, with humans, the only way we can really communicate and take in information from our environment is through our 5 senses. Right? So we have vision, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. So think about it. When you're revising for your final exams, you are primarily relying on your sense of vision, right? And the amount of information you process is fundamentally limited by the pixels and the receptors in your retina, and how fast you can take that in and process that in your brain. Whereas computers, what are they limited by? They're limited well, in theory they're limitless, but in practice they're limited by the speed of their internal connections and internet connections, right? Which can go up to, gigabits, gigabytes per second, which is extremely fast. That's how AlphaGo was able to train on millions of Go games in a single day, whereas a human player could only probably at most go through 100 or so. So, with that, this is going to be a quick overview of human communication through time from a scientist's perspective. So historians in the audience, please don't criticize me too harshly for this simple depiction. So a long time ago, we started out with oral histories and early cave paintings. So you would have a historian in the tribe keep track of the stories over time and communicate those through speech. And they would also draw paintings on caves. Then in 3000 BC, the Sumerians and the Egyptians started coming up with pictographs and hieroglyphs to communicate with writing, so that was a big advance. And then, depending on whether you believe the Chinese were first or Gutenberg was first, the printing press was invented either in 1049 or 1440, and that really changed the name of the game in terms of written communication, right? The dissemination of thought and ideas could go much, much farther. And then around the 1800s, we start getting technologies like the telegraph and the phone and photography. And these technologies, photography, allows capture of reality, whereas telegraph and phone, they both allow for long distance communication almost in real time, at the speed of electricity. And now we're in the digital age, where people communicate through memes, through social media, text message. And you might think that, that's the end of the line. There's nothing that comes next. But I personally think that pretty soon we're going to be moving from the speed of memes for communication to the speed of thought. Because the next thing is going to be neural activity. We're going to be able to communicate by reading out individual neural activity and potentially even writing that into other people's brains. So, to give you a bit of background about how this is going to happen, think back to the Navi from Avatar, and we'll watch this short video. Let's see here.
The goal of our research collaboration is to restore function to people with paralysis. This can be people who have spinal cord injury, people who have a neurodegenerative disease like Lou Gehrig's disease.
We're able to eavesdrop in on electrical activity and slide a cursor across a keyboard and type out messages.
Our research is focused on an area called the motor cortex. The motor cortex is responsible for generating movement on the opposite side of the body. Even in cases where you have paralysis, those cells, those neurons in that area of the brain are still active.
We can surgically implant a tiny electrical sensor that's made out of silicon that has 100 tiny electrodes that just sits on the surface of the brain, and it's able to pick up on the electrical activity of individual brain cells or neurons.
We record tiny signals from those neurons, those brain cells, called action potentials. We can then take those signals and decode them using a computer. We can manipulate them once they're in digital form like any other data.
So all you need to do is imagine moving your right arm, for example, to the letter T on a keyboard, and it'll slide out to the T. And in addition to that, we're also able to detect when you wish to select that letter T.
Our participants were able to type at rates anywhere from 12 to up.
Alrighty, so that's just a very brief overview of the brain-computer interface, which is this technology that promises to be able to read out your neural activity and then take that information, decode it using artificial intelligence methods, and then do something with it, like control a prosthetic arm, potentially, or control your digital device. So there are several companies that are working in this space, among them Facebook, Neuralink, Kernel, which are all developing implantable electrodes to record from the brain. And there's also another company called Halo Neuroscience, which actually they already have a product on the market. And this is this headphone that you can wear while you're doing some sort of motor task, like whether you're trying to learn how to play guitar or you're doing a sport. You can put on this headset and it'll direct current into your brain, and it promises to enhance motor plasticity to improve learning. I haven't tested it myself, so yeah, you can go try it later. So there are a lot of potential benefits of brain-computer interface technology. One of which was highlighted in the video, is to improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. You can imagine if you have someone who's, for instance, lost control of their arm due to a spinal cord injury, and you can give them this brain-computer interface and allow them to control a prosthetic arm to restore some of that lost function. Also, the potential to type and control devices simply with your mind, right? So this could mean that when you want to send a text message, instead of having to pull out your phone and type it out, instead you just think, send a message, and it sends. Also, instead of saying, hey Siri, now you could just think, hey Siri, right? Wouldn't that be cool? And then the personal assistant could act on your thoughts. I don't know. I don't know if you actually want that, because sometimes you might accidentally set it off here and there. But also, so not only can we read from the brain, we can also write into the brain potentially, right? So I alluded to this earlier, but there's also the potential to experience others' emotions through this technology, right? You can imagine if you had two people who both had brain-computer interface implants, and one of them thought something and said, oh, I want to send this feeling, say, of love to my partner. And then they would receive that information and it would stimulate the proper neurons in their brain to create that feeling, that shared emotion. And potentially, with write capability, you could even learn by downloading information directly into your brain. So imagine going to bed at night, you stayed out kind of late partying, and you didn't study for that test tomorrow. Well, you're saved with the brain-computer interface. So it seems like this technology is really great, right? But there are a lot of ethical questions that are actually raised by this technology, as you might expect. And the question of how far should we push the limits of the human brain with brain-computer interface technology is, I find, a very interesting and important one, since this technology is, I'd say maybe 20 years down the line, will be put into practice at the latest. So how far should we push the limits of the human brain? Well, the first thing to consider are the side effects. As Nigel alluded to earlier, anything involving manipulation of the brain is going to have side effects. And whether we're comfortable, whether patients are comfortable going through this process, getting this electrode implanted into their brain, and potentially dealing with issues like the electrode could decay, the electrode could cause brain inflammation. These technical and important issues need to be considered by patients and physicians alike. Next off is data security and privacy. You can imagine in a world where we have these brain-computer interfaces and your thoughts are being recorded by this device and transmitted. You can imagine that data security is extremely important, right? Because your thoughts, more so than anything you do, even like the data that you have on Facebook, that's data that they collect from your behavior. But your thought is the unfiltered version of that behavior. And if they have that information, if any malicious actor has that information, then we're in real trouble, right? Because a malicious actor could potentially use that information to predict your political views, right? And then use that information to then target you with advertisements, or even if they hacked your device, they could write in their own political views to suppress your natural ones. And finally, we arrive at the issue of safety and accountability, which I think is particularly interesting from a legal perspective. And this is an area that I think is worth spending a little bit more time on to discuss. So imagine a situation where you have an individual who has one of these brain-computer interfaces, and they use it to control a prosthetic arm. And this prosthetic arm is being used to drive an automobile. And all of a sudden, they're on the road, they're on the highway, and all of a sudden this arm jerks. and hits another car. Who is responsible in that situation? Is it the person? Is it the company who developed the brain-computer interface? Is it the company who built the prosthetic arm and manufactured it? I find that a very interesting question, and it's an open one. And I challenge you to consider your answer to that question, right? Because there's no precedent for this kind of situation in legal systems, because law is predicated on the fact that you can control your thoughts, you can filter those thoughts before they become behavior that is then subject to legal action and legal recourse. Whereas in this case, your thoughts are what's being turned into action directly. And so in that case, whether the person, did the person actually think to jerk the car, or was it a mistake of the decoder computer, or was it a mistake of the robot? It's very unclear, and it's an issue that needs to be addressed before this technology is ready for prime time. So, yeah, I hope that wasn't too much of a downer, but I think I'm pretty optimistic. But to color that optimism a little bit, I think that we need to be very careful about preparing for this technology from a legal and a policy standpoint before it's fully deployed into the wild. Because otherwise we could end up with a world like the Matrix, where we have people with these neural implants and they're put into this false reality, and in the real world they're being used by robots to harness their heat for energy. Instead, we want to create a world like the Navi live in, right? An avatar, where we're able to use this technology, this brain-computer interface technology, to increase our agency and to strengthen the power of human connection. Thank you.
Okay, if anyone has any questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm a climate scientist, and I was very interested by Arabella's talk about certainty and uncertainty and all of that. You might not think of the relation with climate change, but when you work on climate change, one of the biggest problems with communicating is uncertainty, to a level that we are trying to redefine a lot of concepts that we are using to transmit this information, and there's even now a new concept about deep uncertainty. How do we communicate? I'm working on for the next IPCC report, and the IPCC tries to translate the scientific information into something that's relevant for decision making, and it has come to a point where we have to rethink the way to transmit this, that likelihood and probabilities are not sufficient when we try to transmit that. So it was very, very interesting to see that we're using the same language for so different aspects of life.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a great, I think it's another great example of where so much of our decision making and our drive as humans goes towards things that are certain, and we see in all sorts of different aspects of the broader geopolitical landscape, people often manipulating that of knowing that humans strive towards something that's certain. I think we face the same challenge of how to communicate uncertainty in medicine. So more and more recently there is, the cornerstone of good medical practice is patient-centered care and shared decision-making. But for true shared decision-making, we really have to authentically work out how we can communicate uncertainty to our patients. And I think it's a challenge. We know that humans don't understand risk very well. We don't understand probabilities, and I think part of it is going to be changing a culture, which is no easy feat, and really is something we've been striving for millennia to work out how we truly can embrace uncertainty. But I think having more of these conversations is probably the first step.
Yeah, so
Nigel, I was wondering about something that's been talked about quite a lot in the last couple of years. It's nootropics, and I was wondering if you could comment on the actual efficacy of nootropics and whether there's any kind of long-term feasibility of that.
I guess I suspected that people in light of the department in which I work might ask me questions like this, sort of cognitive enhancers and neurotropics. The reason that I ended, or came very close to the end of my talk, talking about homeostasis and balance, was very intentional, because I imagined that might be a direction questions would flow. And the point being that actually the changing one biological pathway using neurotropic agents is probably not going to give you a good outcome. That it's a little bit like the therapies that are used in the context of certain diseases. So Parkinson's disease would be an obvious example, where simply elevating the level of the missing neurotransmitter, the dopamine in that case, doesn't produce at all a good outcome in the way that you might anticipate. Because what happens is the system compensates against these disproportionately elevated levels on the pathways that remain intact, and then does exactly the opposite of what you might wish to have happen, and that is to actually downregulate the pathways to offset the impact of this artificially high concentration of in this case, therapeutic agents. That's exactly what is being unearthed, perhaps unsurprisingly, using agents such as this, that you would think you're onto something, and then there is a compensatory effect that you've got to then understand to offset why the agent didn't work in the way that you might anticipate from the sort of one drug, one target mindset. So if I was going to advocate anything at all, I would say that you've got to understand what the regulatory mechanisms are in some considerable detail before you start manipulating them. And one drug, one target, one outcome is increasingly a naive approach to produce good outcomes in all sorts of respects. And I think this is part of the reason that Big Pharma is really struggling to bring drugs into the marketplace now, that we've come quite close to our limits in that sort of strategy and space, and that the low-hanging fruit have already been picked, and we've got to get a bit smarter in our strategy.
So is the field consensus generally that nootropics are ineffectual?
I think the field consensus is more mixed than that, if I'm really honest. Because, of course, you've got to remember that some people's research endeavours are all predicated on bringing about good outcomes for these. And so if you didn't believe that ultimately you'd get the solution, you probably wouldn't be minded to carry on down that particular line of inquiry. So I think there are the slightly cynical people like me that think you've got to rather understand a little bit more about the basics before you bring about a good outcome. And there's those people that will say, we'll play it a bit like the lottery. We'll throw lots of combinations at it and hope to reveal a good outcome without ever fully understanding quite how we realised it.
So in other words, you prefer certainty?
Yes, quite.
Yeah. Hi, my question is to Arabella. So my name is Pereira. I really enjoyed your talk. And when you spoke about uncertainty, I think I smiled because first it reminded me of when I first started as a doctor, getting up at 2 in the morning. But also when I started my DPhil, it was quite uncertain. And my question is, don't you think the stress response to uncertainty is perhaps a kind of normal response, and there's a variation in how people respond to that? And perhaps, in your situation, if you weren't stressed by that uncertainty, perhaps you wouldn't have phoned your dad, which may have been the optimal situation in the scenario. So how do you kind of normalize kind of being okay with uncertainty, but also having that response in terms of you stress kind of manner?
So I think this is an excellent question because it's really one of the big challenges. So we know that uncertainty drives our curiosity, which undoubtedly drives our performance. And a little bit like there's the Yerke-Dodson curve that many of you may know. It's a bell-shaped curve that looks at stress against performance and showed very clearly that too little stress actually doesn't give us a good performance. We're sort of bored and we don't perform well. Too much stress and we burn out. And there's an optimal amount of stress that leads to an optimal amount of performance. And I think you can sort of think about uncertainty in the same way. So if you were to have your sort of acknowledgement of uncertainty along the x-axis in your bell-shaped curve, you have this arena where too little acknowledgement of uncertainty and going into premature closure because you're stressed by uncertainty leads to very poor performance. too much dwelling in a space of uncertainty undoubtedly is equally unhelpful and can lead to indecision amidst a sort of paralysis. And that again, there's a sort of optimal amount of uncertainty, and it's how we optimize that sweet spot of learning how to embrace uncertainty more comfortably, because there's no doubt we know that burnout and depression have very negative effects on patient care and on individual outcomes. So I think it's trying to work out how we sit in that space, and I think some of that is changing our culture, because the reality is we do have a culture within medicine which is slowly changing, but has for a long time equated uncertainty with ignorance or failure. And I think we see too rarely sort of role modeling of really embracing uncertainty.
Hi, my question is for Michael, but I think you have a brilliant and very interesting talk. A subset of the disabled community argues, which I don't necessarily agree with, but they argue that searching for a cure for some disabilities or going deep into the brain for those cures can actually be harmful to people who really identify as disabled and find strength in that and are not asking for a cure. So in the spirit of medical ethics, I'm wondering how you would respond to that argument, or what,
Yeah, thanks. That's a really good point. And I think that ultimately, in these situations, the decision of the patient's autonomy, that is, needs to be respected. So I think that every patient has the right to be informed by their physician. Say if someday this brain-computer interface technology is prescribed, essentially, to people with disabilities, then I think the person is ultimately the one who has that decision-making power. And I think that it's easy to, like you said, it's easy to kind of overtreat and assume that people want this technology, especially I think in cases where you're dealing with vulnerable populations, like people who are disabled, who might not be able to express their thoughts or views at times, right? Like you can imagine a situation where you have someone with locked-in syndrome, and they would really benefit from this technology because then they could use their brain to type because they're fully paralyzed. But in that case, like, how do you go about getting consent? And I think there's not really an easy answer to that. You'd have to turn to friends or family in most cases, but it's definitely, there's a lot of gray there. And you also run into the issue of not only like giving people who don't want devices, but also not giving devices to people who really need them, right? And if this brain-computer interface technology really does take off, then you can imagine a world where you have this kind of BCI-equipped elite who are neurocognitively enhanced. They're able to be a lot more productive, and it kind of goes in parallel with the recent trends in technology that are essentially exacerbating inequalities across the world. So it's important to be mindful of both sides, I think. But that's a great point.
I have a question for Dr. Simpkin. How can we learn to embrace uncertainty in the beginning from an everyday level so that it comes naturally once you are thinking about the
So great question. How can we learn to embrace uncertainty? I think you can sort of think about it in different aspects. So I think we can think about how we learn to embrace it for ourselves. And I think really the first step is to acknowledge it. I think too often we fail to even acknowledge it and to work out what our own gut reaction to uncertainty is. So where do we sit as an individual on that scale of how stressed uncertainty makes us? We know that tolerance of uncertainty is a state, not a trait. So it is a modifiable behavior. And so just first of all, kind of acknowledging where you sit and how you sit when you think about being in a space of uncertainty. I think then also recognizing that we sort of do see the world through our own implicit biases and making sure we recognize those so that we're aware of when we are closing down too soon because we're wanting to strive for this certain space. And I think within that, there's sort of a lot of tests you can do online, the implicit association test. If you Google it, you can sort of begin to look at where your biases lie. And it's often really sort of mind-blowing because I think we all think we don't really hold these biases and assumptions. There's something called prospective hindsight, where you temporarily assume that your sort of working diagnosis or your current decision is wrong, and go back and re-look at the data that you're trying to sort of form that decision with, to see whether you start to see that data with fresh eyes, trying to narrow down your blind spot. And then I think in many ways, at a sort of cultural level, beginning to really role model that it's okay to say, I don't know, and that it's okay to admit uncertainty. I think at a system level, in medicine, there are 87,000 ICD codes for diagnoses. There is no ICD code for I don't know. There is no billing code for I don't know. We're now in a world where we're often forced to turn the patient's grayscale narrative into drop-down black and white boxes. And so I think a lot of this is also sort of changing the way we interface, but really that sort of acknowledgement, I think, is the first step.
Yeah, could I ask a follow-up question? Yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on kind of the patient experience side of uncertainty. Because a lot of patients go to the clinic in order to be comforted, in a way, by their doctors, often like absolute diagnosis of what their condition is. And that's like a source of, I guess it improves people's quality of life because they think that, the doctor knows what's right and they feel better after they come out. So how do you balance that short-term kind of satisfaction with the potential long-term consequences of not acknowledging uncertainty? And to what extent is this issue of clinical uncertainty a cultural issue among the general populace versus like a provider issue?
So a lot of questions in that, but I think that overall, we know that for centuries doctors were seen as the sort of knowledge purveyor, and that patients came to the doctor seeking knowledge. And over the last sort of 20 years, we've really shifted that hierarchy to sort of flattening it, where now patients often come in armed with a lot of information. They also have access to the knowledge. And I think they often now come to us as a doctor seeking certainty. They want to know what they should do. And I think terms like precision medicine and evidence-based medicine don't really help our sort of cause, where we do risk this sort of widening mismatch between expectation and reality. I think that it interestingly has been shown that actually trust in your doctor goes up when you say, I don't know. But you don't just leave it at that. You say, I don't know what's going on here, but I'm going to be with you on this journey. I don't know what's going on with you, but we're going to work through this together. And that trust has been seen to go up. And we know that trust between the patient-provider is critical and has documented good healthcare outcomes that we don't quite understand. So interestingly, in many ways, actually saying I don't know, but in a structured format, really actually does help. And I think as we move further forwards, there's no doubt that moving to shared decision-making is really going to require us as physicians to work out how we authentically communicate uncertainty to our patients. But it's been seen to be actually a net positive, depending on the communication strategy. It comes back in a way to the climate change. How do you actually communicate this in a way that's helpful?
Thank you.
Another question for you. Do you think we got worse as a population at dealing with uncertainty?
I think ironically we for a long time thought that increases in knowledge were going to increase our certainty. So I think we sort of lived in this false sense of naive optimism. I also think the challenge is that we've really got this widening mismatch. So as I said, we evolve on a millennial timescale, but we're in an environment that really is rapidly evolving around us, and we know that we're sort of at the kind of Moore's law part of the curve, where technology now is increasing exponentially. And I think Michael's talk was a great example of actually the sort of limitless potential of where technology could go. And so I think the reality is, for a long time, we as humans, have been the sort of purveyor of knowledge and have strived through being able to sort of rote learn and recite information. But now the machines are really going to take that over. And so I think the biggest struggle is not that we've changed in how we approach it, but that there's a widening mismatch between where our value as humans will sit, which really is within the grayscale space, and how we have sort of evolved to really sort of strive against embracing that.
You said that uncertainty, curiosity, uncertainty drives curiosity. I'm wondering whether uncertainty is an important prerequisite for original thought, and could that be mapped in some way with these electrodes, and possibly see whether those who are uncertain are more likely to be capable of original thought?
I think it's a great point. I mean, I think there's no doubt that uncertainty and curiosity go hand in hand, and so originality definitely comes out of uncertainty. And it's trying to make that productive. So we know when we put people in MRI scanners that often the amygdala really fires up, sort of setting off this alert and threat system, and how you can channel that productively. But it's definitely in seeking questions to the unknown and in sitting comfortably with uncertainty that I think we have made many of our great discoveries.
And are uncertain people more likely to go off the main pathways?
I mean, I think it's again about where you're sitting with that uncertainty. So I think too much sitting in uncertainty actually leaves you in a space of paralysis where you're unable to make a decision. So I think there's a sort of difficult arena of sort of titrating that, and I might hand over to my neuroscientist colleagues here for an answer to that part of the question.
Okay.
Sure, yeah, I can say a bit about, you mentioned how could you measure uncertainty with something like electrodes. And I think there's the potential to measure uncertainty in the form of something called synaptic plasticity, which you may have heard of. It's the ability of the brain, especially during development, during early childhood, to kind of meld itself into different forms. And I think that this is kind of an almost evolutionary approach to solving the problem of uncertainty, because, you know, humans in any environment, you're essentially born into a world that is ever-changing, right? You might be born, if you were selected from a hat at random, you might be born in Asia, or you might be born in, you know, the West, in the US. And whatever kind of role and society you're born into, that is malleable, right? And our brains are designed almost to address that kind of uncertainty by the plastic nature of it that allows us to craft our childhood synaptic connections to suit whatever role we're going to specialize in later. And I think Nigel probably can speak a lot more about that since this is his field. But
difficult to know quite how to respond to that, because I have to say I sort of diverge a little bit with both of our speakers as being a little bit more pessimistic about some of the great ambitions that they herald. I mean, in terms of the plasticity space, the basis of neuroplasticity is not well understood at all. That 50 years of inquiry into this endeavour are still yielding mostly blanks in terms of properly understanding what's going on at the synaptic level in terms of what drives plasticity and what that all means. So any prospect of actually laying down a sort of new memory map or creating plastic modifications that carry useful information forward is quite some way off. And that whilst the brain-computer interfaces that Michael demonstrated there out of Stanford look very glittering, in reality what they're actually doing is little more than connecting a series of electrodes to the outputs of something like a computer printer. So that in truth the readout is really rather modest and it's not terribly impressive, although it might seem so on first presentation of that. Where it will get very impressive is actually understanding what the real neural coding process is. And we know that this is a world away from what computers are doing. And the biggest clue there, Michael already mentioned in his talk, look at the power consumption of the human brain as compared to a computer. The idea is that if you had the same connectivity ratio in a computer, in conventional computing design as the human brain is able to manage at the moment, you'd be in the megawatt space in terms of per day consumption. We're running on 30 watts an hour. This is a very, very different processing machine that we've got here, and it's processing things in a very different way to computers. So using electrodes to read out motor outputs or sensory inputs, I would regard that as interesting and therapeutically beneficial, but fundamentally and conceptually still sort of trivial. Deciphering the neural code, that's really exciting. Do we have the answer to that? No. Do we have any clues as to what it might be? No. At the moment, we're a very long distance away from that. And I'm afraid this is why I'm the sort of naysayer of the piece as I'm sitting here listening to this again. This is lovely, and I hope this is all to become manifestly true, but I just don't feel that way. I won't see it in my lifetime, perhaps because I'll be beaten upon after this talk, actually. But, I'm really not quite as optimistic as our younger speakers, shall we say.
Sorry, I think that's all we've got time for this evening, unfortunately. So would you join me in thanking our panel tonight?